Hello, is it working? Yes, okay, all right, good. Okay, so my name is Katsu Hirano. I teach history at UCLA. I'm really sort of excited to introduce Hajimu Masuda, Professor Hajimu Masuda. Actually, we have known each other since I was teaching at Cornell. He graduated from Cornell, and so he was a graduate student when I was assistant professor there. So our relationship was more of sort of like friendship, more than sort of mentor and student relationship. And so I was actually asked to sit, I can just give you a brief anecdote as a way to introduce Professor Masuda. I was asked to sit on the dissertation prize committee in history department. And in that year, we had, I think, about 9 dissertations. And committee consisted of me, and then someone who works on French history, I think, and then someone who works on American history. And we all, of course, we read dissertation, and then decision was very, very easy because everybody agreed that his dissertation just stood out completely. You know, he was so outstanding that we actually didn't have to have any discussion about it. So one person who taught American history, actually African American history, she said, you know, Katz, there's no need to discuss. Masuda is the one who should be receiving the prize, which anyway, I agreed from the very beginning. So I was like, you know, okay, sure. So actually we spent probably 5 minutes to make a decision. It was the quickest sort of meeting I ever had in terms of deciding on this sort of prize. So let me just explain why I think his project was not a little bit, but quite unique and outstanding. He actually uses really new methodology, sort of in the field of so what we call diplomatic history, international history. And still now, I think he's oftentimes misunderstood as a historian of diplomacy and military conflict, unfortunately. But if you read his work, he uses social and cultural history perspective. That is, he really pays attention to ordinary people's perception of the Cold War. And so he explored more than 50 archives all over the world, reading different kind of languages, which is already quite amazing. So he went to China, India, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and of course US and Japan to really explore different types of archives so that he can really construct new kind of history and perspective on about Cold War. So I think that's the kind of issue that today he's going to talk about. And so I'm really excited to introduce Professor Masuda. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Okay, so thank you very much, Katz, and thank you everyone for coming today. So let me begin this talk by reading a couple of portions of my book. Well, it's a little bit a long quotation, but bear with me. I'll explain later why I read this part. Okay. Okay, so it's from chapter 4. Chapter 4, Politics of Impression. Okay. In mid-November 1950, a letter arrived at the Beijing municipal office at the Chinese Communist Party. Although the office had been receiving hundreds of letters, particularly following the public announcement of the entry of the Chinese people's volunteers into the Korean conflict, this letter, written by a young worker at the Beijing Municipal Bureau for Cleaning, might have drawn special attention from local cadres. To begin with, unlike many other letters that were labeled Ji Yuan Shu, it's a letter for enlisting, letter for volunteering, this one was labeled Yi Jian Shu, letter of opinion. In addition, instead of supporting the official line and enthusiastically volunteering for the army, this young worker straightforwardly expressed his concerns and opinions, and in the end, refused to go to war. It read, it's his letter. So when I learned about the Korean issue, my understanding was still inaccurate, and I was thinking that the Korean War was not deeply relevant to us. Through some study, however, I have realized that such a view was merely a narrow ethnic notion. Now I'm not viewing the Korean problem as an isolated issue. I see it as a part of American imperialism, which follows the path of the Japanese imperialism of the past, using Korea as a stepping stone to invade China. Today, they've been already realizing it. Based on this understanding, I'm joining the Resisting America and Assisting Korea movement for the defense of our country and people, and for the protection of my own security, peace, and daily life. Nevertheless, what I have done so far is just to mobilize other people, and I haven't thought about my opinion and my own action. I have a concept of action, but how can I express it? That's a big problem. Ordinary people have participated in the volunteer army and gone to Korea. How about myself? Also join in the volunteer army? No, I cannot. My mind is messed up. I don't have such a high level of resolution. I don't have such a sense of self-sacrifice. However much I continue to discuss this matter, I cannot overcome my contradictions. Why can't I equally carry out this duty as other people of proletariat have been doing? It's hard for me. It's really painful to me. Okay, so let me read one more letter from the book. This one was written by a 58-year-old man in Shimane Prefecture in Japan. This was written in the spring of 1951. So the two letters are almost written same time. Quote, I feel gloomy about the superficiality of Japan's national character and its society today when I see such women jumping on the bandwagon of the current of the times, getting positions in important posts such as mayor or congressman. Women who put forth practically impossible argument against rearmament are virtually traitors to our country. It's no exaggeration to say so in view of today's world situation. From old times, the saying, there are women behind the history, always means tragedy and collapse. Women's participation in politics rarely produced a positive result. While we cannot take legal measures to ban women's political involvement, we should seriously question the appointment of women to important and practical posts in politics. Their anti-rearmament argument is, after all, a purely empty theory that ignores a real situation in the world. I seriously doubt the existence of their conscience. Well, this is not my opinion, by the way. Anyway, I read these portions of my book because they represent the kind of source materials I wanted to bring into the study of the Cold War history and post-war history in general. I was thinking that I might be able to offer a new way of understanding the Cold War and post-war history by incorporating these materials. And I think I was thinking so because I had an uncomfortable feeling about the ways in which the history of Cold War has been written. Looking back in general, diplomatic historians, as you know, have tended to focus on the questions of the origins of the Cold War, and usually concentrate on elite policymakers, calculations, considerations, personalities, and so on. And on the other hand, social and cultural historians have tended to look at effects of Cold War on society, culture, and daily lives of ordinary people. So furthermore, the large majority of the Cold War literature has centered on the US and Europe until very recently. So thus, what Asian specialists have tended to do has been to look for to find out elements of the Cold War in Asia, exploring how the global conflict had impacted on that continent. So therefore, looking at these trends, these trends, one might end up with the following impression. That is, policymakers' conduct shaped the Cold War, which in turn had enormous after effects on society, culture, and ordinary people's daily lives. And also, Asia could not escape being dragged into the global conflict, right? But I think such a narrative is problematic for two reasons. First, as long as we continue accepting this narrative, we will continue to view society, culture, and ordinary people's daily life as passive entities under the global and political conflict. And thus, we cannot think about how they might have conditioned and shaped the way in which Cold War was made. Second, as long as we continue to view Asia as a passive end recipient of the global confrontation, we will continue to accept these Euro-American-centric perspectives. And thus, we cannot imagine how Asia might have participated in the making of the Cold War simultaneously. So, in a nutshell, and to put it very bluntly, I think our common Cold War narratives seem to take for granted quite specific, very specific social views and world views as natural perspectives. That is, the social view that put elite policymakers at the top of society, and the world view that put the West at the center of the world. So that's why in my book, Cold War Crucible, I wanted to incorporate ordinary people's voices into a larger project on the Cold War, and I wanted to do so through global and comparative perspectives. So in doing so, I think I wanted to write a people's history of the Cold War with the people, not just the victims and not just the heroes and the heroines, but those who involved in quite a brutal and scary activities as well. So eventually, my book arrived at a very simple question, which I didn't really think about before. That is, what was the Cold War? Well, what really was the Cold War? So this book, my book, argues that it was more than an international confrontation between Western and Eastern blocs. It was also a social mechanism of purity and ordering at home in the chaotic post-World War II period. Thus, what this book describes is not when the Cold War began or who initiated it, but how the reality, in quotation mark, reality of the Cold War was produced and supported and functioned, and how numerous people utilized and even took advantage of it. So in this sense, this is not really a Cold War history that presupposes the existence of the Cold War. It's more like a historical inquiry into the fantasy of the Cold War, focusing on its imagined and constructed nature, as well as social needs of, for such an imagined reality. So I wrote in my book, so this book is an attempt to rewrite the formation of the Cold War through synthesizing social and diplomatic history and local and global history. And I further wrote, re-examining the Cold War in this way, Cold War Crucible hopes to open up discussions as to why such an imagined reality materialized during the Korean War period, why numerous people throughout the world participated in its formulation, and finally, what the Cold War truly was. So this is this book's core questions and arguments. However, if there is anyone who are most surprised at hearing such an ambitious project, it's perhaps me, myself, because I didn't plan to write such a history, and I didn't plan to write such a book when I began this project 10 years ago. So in order to introduce my project, let me talk about how it developed and became what it is through tracing some key steps and turning points in my research. So the first step was the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri in 2005. So today, many people think I'm an Asianist and I'm an anti-diplomatic history scholar, but I'm also an Americanist and I'm also a diplomatic historian in a way. So in fact, in the very beginning, I was planning to write a paper on diplomatic history concerning US strategies during the Korean War. And more specifically, I was interested in why the US changed its initial cautious stance and took on more aggressive policy and eventually escalated the war in October 1950 through its decision to cross the 38th parallel northward. To be sure, there are many studies concerning US strategy in the Korean War, but most focus on elite policymakers, considerations and personalities, as well as military and geopolitical dimensions. And there hasn't been much work on domestic politics and ordinary people's environment. Of course, domestic politics almost always weighs heavily on any foreign policy making process in the US, but such was particularly the case for Truman administration. This was because Truman, the administration enjoyed little support from his party. And even that support was fading following the communist victory in China, Soviet Union's successful atomic bomb test, Senator Joseph McCarthy's criticism of the State Department, as well as, and above all, the outbreak of the Korean War. And in addition, this was a midterm election year in the US. Thus, in order to examine the impact of domestic politics and election campaigns upon foreign policy making, I looked at not only on the Truman administration's Korean War strategy, but also its election campaigns in the year of 1950. Then I realized that I couldn't stop there because the issue of domestic politics inevitably led me to another project, that is the issue of McCarthyism and the legacy of anti-communism in American culture. So I was curious about what impact McCarthyism had on foreign policy making, and what kind of interplay existed between culture and politics. However, I wasn't fully satisfied with the existing scholarship on McCarthyism and anti-communist politics in the US in general, which I thought predominantly focused on the question of origins and roots. But I don't really care about who began it. And also, I don't care much about the cultural roots and the anti-communism tradition in American culture. I care about how and why such a phenomenon was accepted and spread among large portions of the population at a specific moment, and how ordinary people at the time accepted and even took advantage of it in their everyday lives. And also, I thought that much of the existing literature was too obsessed with questions of whether there was a Red Scare or actual Red Menace or not. And I don't care about that either. There should be both aspects. What I care about is how such McCarthyism or the anti-communist climate functioned in society and how people adapted it on the ground. So, in order to think about this point, I decided to hit the road again and traveled to dozens of archives and libraries in the US, which I thought relevant to think about the issue of anti-communist politics in the US. So at that time, the question I had in mind was not so much when or who began anti-communist politics, but how it functioned in society. So more specifically, I focused on a simple question, that is, who purged whom for what purposes? By the way, so these are images from my archival research trips in the US. Well, you might have a wrong impression about the nature of my trip, but yeah, these were from my research. But as you can see, I found that my trips always gave me lots of fun and enjoyment, which satisfied my taste for traveling and backpacking. But anyway, through my research, I came to think that perhaps we need to reconsider the nature of McCarthyism in general from outset. That is because when we call this phenomenon McCarthyism, our attentions are focused on Senator Joseph McCarthy and congressional hearings such as HUAC hearings. Of course, recent scholarships has aptly and reasonably criticized this focus. But still, we generally consider McCarthyism as an anti-communist movement, as an example of the Cold War at home, whether calling it the Second Red Scare or Korean War Red Scare. Yet, by labeling and perceiving the phenomenon as anti-communist politics, I think we will be missing other diverse social suppressions which silence the various local struggles involving, for instance, racial, labor, gender tensions in post-war America. So through my trips and readings, I came to realize that the victims during the so-called McCarthy period included not only communists and communist sympathizers, but also African Americans, the civil rights activists, labor movement activists, working women and feminist activists, gays and lesbians, and New Deal advocates, the advocates of New Deal programs such as public housing program and universal healthcare programs, and so on. So what these groups represented, of course, was not communist ideology, but elements of social change which emerged from the experience of the Great Depression and World War II. So therefore, taking a social point of view, we can pose the following hypothesis. That is, the true nature of McCarthyism, which is often considered Cold War at home, was not really that of anti-communist politics, but waves of grassroots backlash against the social change itself under the name of anti-communism, which functioned to pacify social upheavals in post-war America. So indeed, the rhetoric of anti-communism functioned very well, very efficiently in containing these elements of post-war change. And the reality of the Cold War was not just useful, but necessary to continue silencing such disagreements at home. So when I noticed this point, I realized that it was not only a matter of American history. As a matter of fact, this was a historical moment when a wave of domestic purges swept across the world. Suppression of counter-revolutionaries in the People's Republic of China, the White Terror in Taiwan, Red Purge in Japan, crackdown of un-Filipino activities in the Philippines, anti-labor agitation in the UK, and as I said, McCarthyism in the US. Of course, each phenomenon has its own history, and the degree of violence involved varied greatly. The violence involved was so different. And thus, it's not surprising that they have been examined separately. And yet, I was curious why these somewhat similar purges occurred almost simultaneously during the Korean War, especially fall of 1950 and 1951. And I wondered what would happen if we were to remove the Cold War lens when looking at these phenomena. So again, I hit the road and actually took more flights and to do research on these topics. So again, I visited many places, met new people, and ate new food, which made me very happy to be a historian of what I would call global and comparative social history. I've never heard of it, but maybe I'm doing it. Moreover, these trips were constructive and worthwhile, I think, because through my travels, I came to identify significant commonalities among these events and came to view this wave of domestic purges as a simultaneous global phenomenon of purification and ordering in chaotic post-war world. So here, let me introduce just a few examples, beginning from the case of Red Purge in Japan, in which, roughly speaking, 13,000 people were fired from various industries in the fall of 1950. So, as its name suggests, this phenomenon has been observed through Cold War lens. The traditional understanding is that this is the purge of communists and communist sympathizers conducted by the US and GHQ, US General Headquarters in Tokyo, in order to create an anti-communist country in East Asia. However, when we look more closely at who was fired and why, we can see that the communists and communist sympathizers were not the only target, and that the GHQ was not necessarily controlling the development of this Red Purge. So here, let me introduce just one case, that of Nippon Kokan, which is Nippon Steel Tube Company, which fired 190 workers in the fall of 1950. So the dispute began with an announcement made by company president in October 1950. He said that he was compelled to discharge these workers, quote, who hindered the smooth operation of the company's business or refused to cooperate with the company, unquote. Well, but that's a quite broad criteria, isn't it? Even American officials often considered controller operators of Red Purge were alarmed by this announcement. One of them, Robert Amis, chief of labor divisions, in fact warned the company and instructed the company to withdraw this decision. But the company simply ignored this warning. Meanwhile, a 27-year-old worker, Mr. Ishijima Seiichi, wrote a lengthy petition to Amis and asked for help, explaining that although he was an active union member, he had never been a communist nor communist sympathizer. So this letter, which included a detailed counter-argument against the company's charges, was translated and taken seriously. Amis examined this letter with the help of Japanese officials and again urged the company to re-employ Mr. Ishijima. So this letter, this time the company reacted. They invited Mr. Ishijima to a dinner and admitted that he was not a communist. However, they still refused to re-employ him and instead offered him a deal involving a large sum of money on the condition that he would not challenge the management again before the GHQ or before the public. So Ishijima was in a tough spot. Having a wife and children and no possibility of returning to the company, he apparently accepted this offer. So we don't have any further recourse on him. So GHQ officials were confused and really disturbed by the company's refusal to rehire Ishijima, in spite of the repeated warnings. So one Japanese official explained that Ishijima might be considered troublemaker because as one of the founding organizers of a union at his factory in the post-war years, he had actively criticized the management. So in fact, such case in which companies took advantage of this vague definition of troublemakers are numerous. In this way, the development of the Red Purge went far beyond the control of the GHQ and in practice covered up what were in reality social and labor disputes. And moreover, in many other cases, which I cannot explain here, the mass dismissal at the time actually involved filtering out of non-conformists, dissenters, and malcontents in general under the mantle of the global confrontation. So when we see it this way, the Red Purge doesn't appear as a mere result of the Cold War. Rather, it can be seen as a part of a social mechanism that silenced emerging disagreements at home in the post-war years, which necessitated the continuation of the Cold War. So now, let me introduce another case, the case of a campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries in People's Republic of China, under which more than 700,000 people were executed and more than 1 million imprisoned. So for good reasons, of course, this movement has been considered as the Chinese Communist Party's top-down, coercive, political cleansing campaign aimed at eliminating former Nationalist Party members and sympathizers. However, it could be further examined as well because the CCP was not always the only actor, and ordinary people were not simply victims but often attackers, and the nature of the phenomena was not necessarily a political cleansing campaign. So let me explain why I came to think so. So here, let me introduce one case and to examine how it functioned on the ground in a local context. For example, the Association of Street Vendors in Beijing implemented this campaign in its market in the spring of 1951. So in doing so, however, they used it for their own purposes of tightening morals and creating order among their members. The slogans for their versions of the campaign included, for instance, no delay for tax payments, don't cheat customers, always issue a receipt, use standardized measuring instrument, keep street stall clean. And another slogan was, no pee and no shit on roadside and inside stores. Yep. So clearly, these issues had nothing, I guess, to do with the CCP's struggles against counter-revolutionaries. And yet, interestingly and importantly, these street vendors, the campaigns were framed, conducted, and efficiently carried out as if they were. They claimed that the street vendors were fighting a different kind of war on the home front, that corporations among vendors could stabilize Chinese economy and maintain public order, and that their tax payments would support the fight against Meiji American imperialism on the front line in Korea. And in a similar manner, locals in Dong'an Market in Beijing participated in this movement in their own way. by adopting the guilt by association system, in which 5 households formed one group, monitoring one another. And in the case of someone violating any promises, all members of this group would be punished. Right? So such a mutual surveillance system functioned quite well, quite efficiently. One resident in this district described that the spirit of neighborhood radically improved after the commencement of the counter-revolutionary movement. He reported that the area became cleaner, thefts were eliminated, bumpy roads were repaired, and the residents' disputes were now settled by neighbors' group. So looking at these local campaigns on the ground, I think we can find historical continuity as well. So what the local people aimed at achieving were, for instance, cleanliness as opposed to filthiness, preciseness as opposed to looseness, unity as opposed to disorder. So these were not a new issue, but rather quite a familiar concern in entire modern Chinese history, and definitely the familiar issue during the GMD, the Nationalist Party period. In other words, by observing locals' campaign, we can see the social aspect of movement, this suppression of counter-revolutionary movement, which was not particularly unique to the communist revolution period. The unique point, however, existed not in terms of the contents or goals, but the unique point existed in terms of the ways in which the movement was conducted. So in this campaign, informants and investigators were not necessarily officials and secret police, as it were during the Nationalist Party period, but for the most part, ordinary people. In fact, diverse kinds of counter-revolutionary acts were identified and reported less by official investigations than as a result of unofficial charges through rumors and private accusations among members of workplaces, schools, communities, neighborhoods, and families. Thus, surveillance among one another was so close, and it's no wonder that a massive number of people decided to put an end to their own lives before they were accused or before they were executed. Here, the statistical data on suicide is quite interesting because it contains surprisingly diverse kinds of people. They included not only landlords and ex-Nationalist Party GMD Kuomintang members, but also those categorized as, for instance, roaming persons, local rebels, wartime collaborators, members of secret societies, and those of religious sects, as well as those deemed feudalistic and uncooperative. Heterogeneity of this kind was not coincidental. In fact, the list of those formally executed in this period similarly included diverse kind of people. This heterogeneity, I believe, suggests that we reconsider the nature of the so-called suppression of counter-revolutionaries. After all, if the movement was a purely political cleansing campaign, those who were executed and committed suicide should have been mostly political and ideological enemies, such as landlords, businessmen, as well as ex-Nationalist Party member and GMD, the Nationalist Party sympathizers. Yet, as a matter of fact, a large number of them, particularly those who worked under the GMD government, such as bureaucrats, policemen, teachers, low-ranking officials, actually retained their positions and worked continuously. On the contrary, those actually condemned and eliminated during the campaign against this counter-revolutionary movement involved a much broader and much diverse group of people which fit neatly in the category of social rather than political enemy. They included, for example, members of religious sects such as Iguandao, those powerful gangs such as Yellow O, and those secret societies such as Triad, Green Shirts, and Elder Brothers, as well as common criminals and those involved in what were considered social evils, such as bandits, murders, robbers, local bullies, low-level hoodlums, and brothel keepers, prostitutes, and so on and so on. Apparently, what these diverse people shared was not a single ideology. Arguably, it can be hypothesized that they represented elements embodying the drastic social chaos and change that arose from the recent experiences of the war against Japan and the Civil War, Chinese Civil War. But yeah, White Terror in Taiwan has an interesting story, but let me skip this part in order to finish. So let me wrap up. So to be sure, each phenomena has its own histories and backgrounds, but when examined together, they also seem to reveal certain commonalities. First, all of these suppressions escalated simultaneously against the background of the Korean War, which sparked fear of World War III. Second, against the backdrop of this fear of World War III, the Cold War narratives gained verisimilitude and was efficiently utilized in each case, in each society, to suppress what were actually social and cultural disagreements under the banner of national security. Third, the crux of the matter in each case was, in fact, how to deal with social and cultural change that has emerged from the chaotic experiences of the 1940s, especially World War II. Fourth, in these suppressions, the participants were not only powerful policymakers, but also ordinary people who engaged in the creation and maintenance of social order. So, taken together, the wave of domestic purges in many parts of the world can be seen as a global phenomenon of social purification that operated to contain and suppress elements of social change and disorder in a chaotic post-World War II period. So when we see this this way, what becomes clear, I think, is actuality of local and social conflict and the imagined and constructed nature of the global Cold War, as well as the social needs of such imagined reality to overcome war at home. So in this sense, the Cold War divide that emerged during the Korean War existed less between Eastern and Western blocs than within each society. And each society required the continuation of Cold War to maintain harmonious order at home. So perhaps the Cold War was more than a rivalry among superpowers at the international levels. Conceivably, it could be better understood as an imagined reality that took on the role of social tranquilizer, pacifying various disagreement in the aftermath of World War II. So, so before finishing my talk here, let me discuss the implication of my study. So first, in terms of scholarly implications, I think we could open up new lines of inquiry and discussion as to the reconsideration of post-war history in general. What I have tried to do in this book, in my book, is in a sense to relativize the importance of Cold War narratives in post-war history and try to look at locally specific realities underneath the mantle of the Cold War. So while, of course, while only a handful of cases can be examined in just one book, similar pattern might be observable in other places, particularly in regions and countries that have been viewed through Cold War lens. I'm very curious about whether similar reality-making process and mechanism was in place in other places of the world or not. Okay, and another implication, the last point, has to do with the meanings of studying and teaching Cold War in the 21st century today. So let me finish this talk by reading two paragraphs from the epilogue of my book. Okay. Okay, so we usually think that the Cold War ended about 2 decades ago. This is true if we view the Cold War as a geopolitical, ideological confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. With the demise of the Soviet Union, it seems apparent at a glance that the conflict was an event in the past. However, such is not the case if we see the Cold War as a gigantic social construction of an imagined reality in which many people participated in restoring order and harmony through marginalizing disagreements at home. When we look at the Cold War in this way, the phenomenon doesn't seem to be a peculiar event in a time long past. Rather, it can be said such a pattern has reappeared and in fact has been reinforced in the so-called post-Cold War world in the name of the clash of civilizations and particularly in the decade of the war on terror following September 11, 2001. So to think about the experiences of the Cold War less in terms of the US-Soviet confrontation than as a part of a social mechanism of restoring order at home on a global scale is thus to think about the imagined and constructed nature of reality and history and their social functions on the ground and among people. This recognition, in turn, forces us to reconsider the imagined nature of our reality, our history, our institutions, and the common sense to which we adhere today. To be sure, any human society, to some extent, hinges upon imagination, which assembles these social arrangements and agreements. As we have seen in our story, however, none of these is absolute and immutable. They are always and always will be socially constructed and historically contingent. Therefore, what we can learn seems to be that we need to raise questions constantly instead of being convinced by seemingly authentic reality or history. How real is our reality? How does common sense about ourselves and foreign others contain imagined nature? How is the history we learn at school and from the media constructed? In what way do such reality and history work in society? It is not futile to keep asking these questions and to raise our voices when reality seems out of sync in however small fashion. If there is a lesson that we can learn from our experiences of the reality of the Cold War and its repressive functions on the ground, it is that each of us is not merely an onlooker but a power holder in choosing, changing, and maintaining the reality of the world in the crucible of our own time. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
So we can start taking the questions.
Okay. Yes.
Would you go as far as saying that Cold War, rather than just being constructed as a social fantasy, that it was actually a shared ideology between the East and the West?
Yeah, I think so. That's my argument. Yeah. So I didn't talk in this book talk, but I described in my book is that in order to explain the imagined and constructed nature of the Cold War world, I looked at in which society Cold War reality gained verisimilitude and in which society didn't gain the plausibility. And not surprisingly, what the Cold War fantasy, I would call, gained its verisimilitude in Europe, East Asia, and North America. That is the main actors of World War II. But that reality didn't achieve plausibility in other areas such as South Asia, Africa, Latin America at this very early moment. Of course, these regions later joined in this world in the late 50s. But so I think that the shared experiences of World War II prepared the foundation, the basis to the making of this kind of common mechanism, which I call social mechanism in many parts of the world. Yes?
A couple of questions. First of all, when you sort of list all of the kind of simultaneously occurring sort of movements around the world, the kind of the Soviet Union was one sort of notable absence. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah, many people, the people recommended what was the Soviet Union. But I wish I could read Russian, and I actually attended the first Russian 101 at Cornell, but I gave up because I had to finish my dissertation there. But I hope, to look what's going on in Soviet society. But so I haven't conducted any primary research, archival research in Soviet Union, the Russia. But from my readings, I might say that they also experienced a similar mechanism at that time because many soldiers, many Russian soldiers, went Europe during World War II, and many farmers who knew only their farm life suddenly realized there is the urban life in Berlin or Paris, right? And when those millions of soldiers returned to the Soviet Union, they posed a challenge to the Russian culture because they brought in the more Western, the European culture. So there was also the tension tension about Russian identity, the Soviet identity. And in fact, this Cold War, the narrative was very much used to contain such the foreign identity and to purify their Russian identity. So, but that comes from my secondary readings. So I hope I want to explore that aspect in the future.
And the other question
Yes.
I had was, I wonder if you could talk more about why these sort of global movements of social purification emerged at the time of the Cold War. You mentioned that there was this fear of World War III. I'm wondering, I think if you go back to World War II, you could probably find similar moments of suppression of sort of change. And so is there something new at the time of the war, or is it just a case of kind of taking advantage of a state of emergency to sort of suppress these?
Yeah, I think it was very unique to post-war years and particularly Korean War years because, well, I think I can answer two ways. But the unique because in the post-war period, many new opinions and new challenges came out, like the many women for the first time got a job during wartime. and they wanted to work in society, and that made that posed a challenge to the existing notion. And the moment of like 45 to 50 was the moment of like a huge chaos and disagreements, not only in terms of politics but also social and cultural aspect. And the Korean War was, I think, kind of a triggering moment because it triggers the fear of World War III, as you said, in many parts of the world, but not all parts of the world. In many parts, like Europe, East Asia, and America. And in those societies, the fear of World War III was very much the factor that created a wartime atmosphere, which made many people easy to silence disagreements at home, as they did during wartime. So, yeah. Yes? Hi.
Professor Murray Fromson. I think we have talked before on years, and the whole issue of the Cold War has been a part of my life for many, many years. I'm a Cold War warrior, beginning with John Foster Dulles.
Mm-hmm.
I think the title should have been Cold War Tragedy rather than Cold War Fantasy, because of so many people who died or were the victims of police actions, dictatorial governments all through Southeast Asia, beginning from the time when I covered the war in Korea, and the war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, pardon my comment, because I cannot quite grasp exactly where you're going with this. I'm sure your passion is admirable and commendable, but I don't know how many people really understand how governments that we place faith in were trusted when in fact they did not have a grasp of what reality was like in this whole region of the world. From North Korea down to Singapore, when I first was there when Lee Kuan Yew was beginning professor. It's a tragedy. 56,000 Americans died in Vietnam because why? Oh, the communists are coming, the Chinese are coming. And of course, you know what happened with China. We have a love affair with China. So I'm trying to find out where you're coming from in terms of what your conclusion would be. What do you tell the people who were behind the Cold War fantasy or the Cold War tragedy? How do they explain themselves out for what they did and the consequences that resulted from their presentations, their books, their writings, and so forth?
That's a big question. Maybe 3 points. How do I answer? So the Cold War reality, Cold War fantasy, Cold War tragedy. Yes, tragedy might works. When I say Cold War fantasy, I don't say it's a merely powerless illusion. It's when that fantasy was shared widely, it became reality, right? So yeah. So Cold War tragedy is okay to me, but the moving on. What to say to the people who lived through those periods is I think that's why I think this book has to be written now because of course the history has to be re-examined and written I think every time, and I think the way to talk about history changes I think generation by generation. And I think this year I wrote this book, right? But maybe I might change my opinion if I read the same document like 30 years later. So I think what I say would be like I wanted to write history of the Cold War, not from perspective who experienced that event, but from the perspective of the person who lived after the Cold War. So that's I think maybe something I want to say. One more thing is the kind of to what extent we include various conflicts under the umbrella of Cold War. You just included Korean War and Vietnam War as a kind of a case of Cold War, but actually I think we should think about like Vietnam War or Korean War in its own perspective, because when we look at the Vietnam War and Korean War from a Cold War perspective, we always see it more like the communist versus anti-communist and so on. But when we look at those events from like local people's perspective, it might be different. I think maybe it's the struggle among clans or struggle about social or like economic class and so on and so on. And what I want to do is try to take off Cold War lens and to reinterpret the events what we have been viewing as an event of the Cold War.
The problem is, I see it, the problem I see is that an entire generation following the, quote, end of the Cold War, this generation today doesn't know what we're talking about because they did not experience the terrors and the horrors and the losses that resulted under the Cold War.
Right.
It's like people do not know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The tragedy of Cambodia, for instance. I've been to Cambodia. There at the time of the Khmer Rouge. Horrible consequences there. But there are people from Cambodia who don't know anything about what happened in their lifetime or in the lifetime of their parents and relatives. So memory is a huge problem. Memory is not on the table, not on the table. I believe there may be other people who may have a different point of view. But I live with this all the time. And I don't know what the answer is to this. But I think it should be a warning to people who have sweeping generalizations about what the threats to society are.
Yeah. So by making an argument of this, actually I'm not saying this is the history of the Cold War. This is just my own the perspective, which was written in the like early decade of the 2010, right, around 2015. So what I arrived is more like the kind of imagined and constructed nature of history itself. So I'm not arguing that this is the history. By telling you this history, I'm more sending a message to kind of doubt to the history we usually think as a history. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I like how much, it became very clear when you were talking about how the Cold War, as you sort of redefined it, works as a social mechanism for discipline, essentially. But I was wondering, insofar as the first letter that you read was kind of focusing more on, kind of like intellectuals' desire for radicalization in a certain sense, I wonder if you could talk more about the way in which the Cold War might have operated to kind of produce not just discipline, but also a kind of political disorder or political antagonism. The reason I ask this is because looking at kind of civil rights documents in the United States, or also even like kind of focusing on race issues, but also on like gender and kind of gay rights activism in the United States, you do actually see, as I'm sure you know, you see like quite a bit of kind of cherry picking from sort of communist rhetoric about like the gay, essentially gays acting as a sort of like sexual proletariat or something like that. So I was just wondering if you could talk more about the kind of antagonism that emerged out of it.
Antagonism of what?
Essentially,
Sorry.
what I see your talk pointing to, and I think became very clear when you were kind of pointed to the fact that the Cold War effectively hasn't ended by your definition. And I see that operating in terms of essentially the population kind of self-disciplining, like alongside kind of more like larger political discipline, I suppose. But I guess I'm wondering if the Cold War, as you were defining it, also kind of, well, maybe not in terms of your definition so much, but like in terms of the shared fantasy that you're describing, if it is also kind of generative for political dissent, I suppose.
Okay, I think that's what I'm
Okay. Well, so I'm asking, could you just maybe exemplify it a little bit more, because you were focusing primarily on discipline. So I'm asking if there's kind of, if you could provide more of an example about the dissent.
Oh, I see.
The discipline means kind of silencing function.
Uh-huh.
You focus on the silencing function.
Right.
He's asking whether Cold War fantasy, if that function of kind of generative forces for more conflict, more.
I see. On the from like the opposite side as well.
Uh-huh.
So for the kind of, well, yes, I think so. Yeah, that's right. I focus more on how it functions for that. Like ordinary people are more conservative side, but I think it functioned quite well too for the for instance like leftists who had been in a position of silence, because it is also the opportunity for them to make their own group, the tightening their moral and their group. So it was also, I think, this fantasy, this Cold War reality was useful not only for conservatives, but also for those who are repressed. And I think this is true even if we look at the global scale. So I just said in one society it works well for those groups, and for the global scale, it functioned quite well for like non-alignment group as well. For like for those who just got independent from the imperialist country. So for those like Indonesia or India or Egypt, for them the Cold War reality was useful because by seeing not to follow to each side, they can assert their independent opinions, and thus they strengthen their legitimacy and sending a message to their own people that they are not controlling by either east or west side. So in short, I think the Cold War, the narratives was not only useful for those conservatives, but also quite useful for many other groups as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think she was first.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I really like your translational approach and how it was like simultaneous global phenomena. I just wanted to comment on one thing. Like, you listed many countries and you looked into different societies, but I couldn't help notice that you did not include Korea in this, even though it's a Korea wartime period. So I wonder if you have looked through some of the examples in Korean society during the period.
Yeah, Greg Brzezinski also said me. Greg Brzezinski is the scholar at George Washington University. And he also said, Hajimu, there is no Korea in your book. And that's true. I have a very brief discussion on Korea. And the reason is that very much primary sources. Well, I studied Korean a little bit in order to read some secondary sources, but fortunately for me, suddenly I found the Japanese translation appeared. So I quit studying Korean. And then, because I didn't use Korean archival materials, I thought a little bit, I feel a bit hesitant to discuss like Korea in this book. Yeah, so that's another, I don't know, future project, like Soviet Union case, Korea case.
I mean, basically, I do the same thing. I'm just curious because you mentioned, but by the way, thank you very much for the interesting.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned that Korean was a triggering point in your discussions. So I just wondering, is there some reason for you to avoid or exclude Korea here? Because in my knowledge, like these Cold War, the fantasies of tragedy, this is not just like aftermath, it's still ongoing issues in Korea. So if you include your future research project in part of like the perspectives of Cold War from Korean perspective as well, it's going to be really interesting. So it's basically the same thing we should just mention.
Yeah, so as we just discussed, I'm organizing an international workshop at NUS, and the title of the workshop is something like Unlearning Cold War Narratives Toward Alternative Understanding of Cold War World or not. And I wanted to have this workshop because I don't have the much knowledge on Africa or Latin America or Korea, Soviet Union. So I wanted to have a participant who are studying those areas, and I wanna think about what's going on in the area, and I wanna develop my future project from that workshop. So please, as you said, please submit your research. Yes.
So, I'm just curious, to what degree did you examine, or how soon the term itself, Cold War, came into widespread use? And the representatives of the various, governments. How soon did they start pressing this term out towards their, populace? Because, in my understanding, immediately after World War II, this wasn't really in that widespread a use. It took some time for this, and so, to really package it as an ideology, you needed to be, in awareness of people. So, for instance, I was born in Czechoslovakia, so there were certainly purges in the 50s on the communist side, and certainly, us against them was, the indoctrination was very much present. However, I just watched a film by Kostas Gavias about the 1950s monster processes in the Czech Republic, and it certainly wasn't packaged as Cold War then, right? And so that's why I'm curious, to what degree does this? I haven't read your book, but affect your scholarship.
Yeah, that's interesting. The term Cold War was, first appeared in George Orwell's description in 1956, and became a little more popular in 1947 and 48 because of the Walter Lippmann's the series article, which he published in Washington Post. But interestingly, during that time, Cold War was written in small character. The Cold War is written in small character. But through the Korean War period, and especially 50s, more people are using Cold War as a capital letter, the Cold War, right? So I think this signifies the gradual realization of Cold War reality from disputable opinions among elite and among elite policymakers and intellectuals to more wider, broader audience. And actually, I discussed that that particular issue in the introduction. Can I read one sentence? The manner of spelling out the phenomenon changed as well. The situation that has been described as a Cold War in small character, or the so-called Cold War in lowercase in the late 1940s, came to be commonly known as the Cold War in capital letters by the mid-1950s. So this transition from lower to upper cases implied that the bipolar confrontation no longer represented one of a number of disputable perspectives, but one that was widely accepted as a substantial, irrefutable actuality. So Yeah.
If I have a follow-up question. So how, so did you encounter in your original source materials, the letters or, you know, personal notes that the terminology Cold War actually used? And, you know, and during the Korean War already?
Yes, increasingly, yes. At least in the US, Japan, yeah. But not in other areas such as, you know, India or,
Thank you.
yes.
I may say so. I look around this audience. Most of you, without due deference, I don't do it. Insult you in any way, not my feelings. Since I lectured to students at the university where I've been professor for many years, it's a mystery because it's a cliche, the Cold War. It's really an excuse for governments, people who aspire to leadership, signed on to the Cold War as a way of getting recognition, promotion, advancement, recognition, all of these things. And it poisoned several decades of people who were caught up in this trap. And I saw it from the very beginning because I was covering the Korean War as a GI. Stars and Stripes. And then later came back as correspondent. Then I came back and went through all of these steps along the way. At one point when I was in Singapore, John Foster Dulles came to Southeast Asia. He came to Manila to form the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, and he stopped in Saigon. I was told by the Associated Press, my employers at the time, go up there for this news conference. And Dulles was holding forth about the Cold War, and he talked about all the countries who are aligned to the SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Among them, he mentioned Pakistan. And I said, Secretary, Pakistan is not in Southeast Asia. India, Pakistan, Russia, the fact of the matter is, Pakistan became a tool of American policy because Dulles and his people in Washington were infuriated by India's recognition of the Soviet Union as a counter-threat to what the United States was involved in. They poured billions of dollars into Pakistan as a thrust competition. We had all of these things that happened, place to place. I happened to be versus GI, correspondent with Associated Press, later CBS News, following all these apprehensions. I don't know where to begin, where to end, but I know that it's an endless kind of almost a cliche, the Cold War. What does the Cold War really mean? The Cold War is memory loss. I don't know. Frankly speaking, from a personal point of view, I've seen too many people die, be killed, or be tortured, be whatever. And those who are opposing the Cold War, or articulating the Cold War, believing the Cold War, or not believing. It's paralyzed the whole two generations of people who don't know how to really find a focal point. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that you're doing a tremendous duty in trying to focus attention on this issue. But just got back from the
One more question.
Huh?
I think we have time. We're running out of time.
Yeah. So I don't know if I can generate any questions Masuda may have.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.